But chapter 17 is an interesting chapter because Absalom makes a decision on how he wants to pursue after David, and the advice that he takes is well, he listens to the advice of two of his counselors. And it's interesting that Ahithophel's advice probably would have been the better choice for Absalom than what Hushai had given to him. But because I think that God was protecting David and ensuring that his reign would continue the way that he intended for it to, the advice of Hushai was followed. And so we'll see how that all kinds of works out in this particular lesson. In 2 Samuel, we have quite a list of people that we can look at. Those that are associated with Absalom, when I say associated with them, these are people that are in Jerusalem or working around them or has some kind of dealings with them in some way. Of course, we have Absalom, we have Ahithophel, which is probably his main counselor, and then Hushai the Archite, which was as we remember, the counselor of David that David sent back to Jerusalem to get into good favors with Absalom. And then we have Zadok the priest and his son Ahimaaz. I'm going to have trouble with names tonight. I can see it already. And Ahimaaz and Abiathar the priest, and then Jonathan. At least I got his name right. And Jonathan was Abiathar's son. Now, those that were still associated with David, but there's some other names that are put in here, and this kind of deals with the genealogy of Amasa. But Amasa was David's nephew and eventually became commander of Absalom's army. We looked at the genealogy last Sunday and we kind of saw how Amasa fit in to the family. And then we have Jithra, which was Amasa's father. And then we have Abigail, which was Amasa's mother, and who was also the daughter of Nahash. And Nahash, which was Abigail's father, was also the Ammonite king. And Joab, David's nephew, was the commander of the army before he was replaced by Absalom. And then we have Zechariah, which is Joab's mother and sister to Nahash. You got all that? Doesn't really matter, to be honest with you, just the associations. But we are going to be looking at Amasa's father here in just a moment. Now, those that are with David, when he left, of course he had his group of people that were with him, the Cherethites, the Perethites, and all that group, and they went with them over the Jordan, and they were on their way to Mahanaim. I'm going to have trouble with names tonight, I'm sorry. But Shobi was a son of Nahash, and he was from Rabbah of Ammon. And Shobi was, if I'm not mistaken, one of the sons of the king, King Nahash, that was favorable to David as the king was. You remember when the king had died, the elder son took over, created problems for David by humiliating his servants. David went after him and did quite a bit of damage to the country at that time. But be that as it may, the younger son seemed to still have the same kind of affection for David as his father did. Then we have Machir, the son of Anil from Lodabar, and this was the individual that took care of Mephibosheth before David took him under his wing. And then Barzillai, the Gileadite from Gilead. And this was another man that showed compassion to David. Now, all three of these people we see towards the end of the chapter as they bring provisions to David and his people after their journey from Jerusalem. Now, the locations that we're dealing with is Jerusalem, Dan, Beersheba, and Rogel, the Huram, the Jordan River, Mahanaim, and Gilead. And we'll take a look at some of those here in just a moment. Now, when we look into the chapter, we start seeing some of the advice that was given to him by Hushai. And his advice was, if you remember, to Absalom was, don't just jump and run after David, but assemble a great army, as big as army as you can get. And he says that the army should be what you can get from Dan down to Beersheba. And what he's referring to is the extent of the country, get everybody that will assemble an army for you together so that when you do attack David, there will be no chance for David to escape from you. Now, the other locations that we have is the locations of the sons of the priest that were bringing the message to David. And Jerusalem being right up around here, the two sons, Jonathan and what was the other guy's name? Ahimaaz, were down in Rogel. And then when they got the message to go, they left and they were in Bahurim when they encountered their first problem, or the problem of being almost discovered. So this is kind of the location of all of these people. Of course, this down here is the Dead Sea. And they were traveling over towards the Jordan. And then finally, this one, I don't know if you can see it too well or not. And you'll probably see it again in the next chapter, but I went ahead and put it in here because the battle will ensue Absalom camps out in Gilead, or in the realm of Gilead, or the region. And David was in Mahanaim. I'm having trouble with names tonight, I'm sorry. And then we have the forest of Ephraim, which the battle, I think, pretty much came to an end. And I just kind of wanted to throw this out to you that from Jerusalem down to Mahanaim was where the two sons of the priest went. And when the battle begins, or at least Absalom will assemble his troops over in the region of Gad or Galium. I'm not sure really where all this is at, but this is the general area in which the battle begins. Now, the chapter synopsis that we have is 5 or 6 things here. First of all, Ahithophel requests 12,000 men to pursue David, or David, however you want to say it. Hushai gives advice to Absalom and delays Ahithophel's attack on David. Hushai sends word to David to escape across the Jordan, and Ahithophel commits suicide. Then we see Absalom pursues David and makes Amasa captain of the army, and David and his company are provided for by many of his supporters. Now, with that said, here's some introductory thoughts, and I'm kind of getting behind myself here. But this particular chapter begins with Ahithophel earnestly wanting to pursue David to execute him. And instead, Absalom follows Hushai's advice to ensure that his forces are strong enough to overcome David's. That's pretty much what was going through his mind. And this chapter presents 3 interesting things. First of all, we see the situation where this woman hides, or men hide in the well. The woman covers it, and then she tells those that are seeking their lives they went someplace else. So the question is it justifiable to tell a lie if that lie saves the lives of the other people? That was one of the things that kind of jumped out at me. Secondly, why did Ahithophel commit suicide? And then thirdly, how do we resolve the differences in the nationality of Amasa's father? We see in 2 Samuel, he's referred to as an Israelite, but when you go to 2 Chronicles chapter 2, he's referred to as an Ishmaelite. So, that's 2 different groups of people altogether. So when you look at the genealogy, we'll just kind of jump through this. His father is referred to by different names. It can be either Jethro, let me go back to it, either Jethro or Ithra, an Israelite, as it says in 2 Samuel 17, or it can be Jether, an Ishmaelite. Now, why the differences in the names, and why the differences in nationality? Well, I found this the other day on the internet, and I thought it was a pretty good answer to all of this. It says that this is a variant of the word, and that variant is similar to the names that we have in today's English, like Joe or Joey. Take me for an example. My legal name is Theodore. When I was growing up, everybody called me Teddy. When I got into trade school, my teacher started calling me Ted, and that kind of stuck with me. So I answered all 3, Theodore, Teddy, or Ted. So that's kind of the same situation here with Amasa's father. I think that the variation is depending on what part of the country he's in, or who who he's with or who may be talking to him. And then finally, as far as a nationality, he can be both when you think about it. And jumping down to, let's say that third point, it says a person, for example, might have a French father and a German mother, and therefore both be German and French. And that may be the situation that we see here. So when he's referred to as an Ishmaelite or an Israelite, that may be because of the intermarriage of the family that brought him about. So I thought it's probably the best answer I can come up with. Other than that, we don't have any additional information in the Bible to explain his lineage. And so if someone points this out to you and say, well, here's an error in the Bible and an inconsistency, and we say, well, this is how we can explain it. So there's an explanation for you. So let's look at the chapter real quick. We only got just a few minutes. I didn't mean to spend this much time going through that, but it happened. As we know, Ahithophel was asked his advice on what to do. So he tells Absalom, now's the best time to take care of David. He said he's in flight, he's in disarray, he's weak from his journey, he doesn't have his forces organized around him. He said this is the best time to get David when he's not ready for it. In fact, he says, give me 12,000 men, I'll go after him, and I'll only strike only the king, and the rest of the people will come back to you, and that everyone will be at peace because you'll be the leader, and David will no longer be your adversary. So Ahithophel was telling Absalom, I'll go do this for you. I'll take care of David, and you can take the glory as king. Now, to me, I think that would be the best advice. When someone is in disarray, that's when you can best catch them. But Hushai, when he was asked by Absalom what to do, his advice was a little different. He says, you know your father. Your father is a vicious warrior. He has killed, thousands of men, and he knows the ins and outs of battle. He says he may be in flight, but he's not going to be caught unaware, and your 12,000 men are not going to do anything to him. He says he's going to be like a bear robbed of her cubs in the field. He says that is your man of war. If you take a bear and take her cubs away from her, she's going to go, just ape crazy and just do whatever it takes to get those cubs back. She'll fight tooth and nail to the very death. And he said that's the way David will react if you fall upon him right now. He said surely he's hidden in some pit or some other place, and that some of them will be overthrown at the first, and whoever hears of it says there is slaughter among the people who follow Absalom. He says when you start slaughtering your people, word's going to get back that your men are being killed by David, and that's going to be that much more difficult for you to hang on to the throne. That David is surely an adversary that cannot be overcome. He said their hearts will melt completely, even those of the most valiant. And he says, therefore, this is what I advise Israel to do. He says, fully gather to you all the men from Dan to Beersheba, like the sand is by the sea in multitude. In other words, get the biggest army that you can gather together and get them organized to go after David. So you will come upon him in some place where he may be found, and we will fall on him, and as the dew falls on the ground, and he and all his men who are with him shall not be left so much as one. Moreover, if he's withdrawn into a city, you'll have such a great number of men, you'll be able to pull the city walls down into the river, and so there's nothing left of it. In other words, David won't be able to escape a huge, vast army that you're assembling. In fact, I think there was something like 20,000 men in Absalom's army, and David had, I want to say about 4,000. So he was grossly outnumbered, but he was still victorious. And I think this appealed to Absalom because the advice that he gave was, instead of Ahithophel going after him, you will be the one that will gain the glory. You will lead the battle. You will be victorious. And when it's all said and done, you will be the one to have claimed victory over David. If you follow Ahithophel's advice, he will be the one that gets the glory of eradicating David from the land. And so the vanity of Absalom, I think, thought, I'm not going to let this man get the glory from me. And the advice of having a huge army to assault David makes a lot more sense than just haphazardly running after him. And so Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the advice of Hushai, the Archite, is better advice. And the reasoning for all of this was that the Lord, I think, was really working, but the purpose was to defeat the good advice of Ahithophel, because in reality, that would probably have been the better advice to follow. But the Lord proposed a defeat, and the intent was to allow Absalom to have disaster brought upon him. Now, knowing what the plans were that Absalom was going to do with David he sends word to, Hushai sends word to David through Zadok and Abiathar, the high priest, or the priest, who passed it on to their sons, and they carried that message. But because their sons were afraid to be in Jerusalem at that time, they were in Rogel, which was just a little ways outside of Jerusalem. And the message was sent by a female servant to them, and that message was to be brought to David. Now, as they were traveling, they came to Behurim, which is maybe just a couple miles down the road, and evidently they knew that they were being pursued. The lad, it says, that had saw them, evidently knew what was going on between the servant and these two men. And I'm not sure if this lad was a spy to follow, what was going on or what, but anyway, he understood what was happening, and he relayed this information back to Absalom. So they go to this man's house. He had a well in his yard, and they lowered themselves down in the well, and the woman covered it and spread grain across the top of it to hide the opening. Now, when the servants of Absalom comes to the woman and ask her if they have seen them, or where they're at, if you know anything about their whereabouts, and the woman said to them, they have gone over the water brook. In other words, they're not here, they've left. And that brought the second question to my mind: how do we resolve this? Is the woman guilty of lying? Or was she of deceit of some kind? Years and years ago, I had a discussion with a fellow that was adamant about what lies were all about. If you were to tell your child, they pulled a tooth, they said, put it under your pillow, and the tooth fairy will bring you $1, in the morning. Well, you're telling the kid a lie because there's no tooth fairy. And if you tell your child a lie like that, then you're facing the punishment that they're told about liars in Revelation chapter 21 and verse 8, where it says that all liars will have their fate in the pits of hell. And so, we kind of went back and forth with this and tried to determine, is it really a lie to tell your kid about a tooth fairy versus lying about where these men are, in other words, to save their life and to save David's life. And one example I can think of that kind of illustrates what this woman did can be approved of by God if we go back to Exodus chapter 1. And that's kind of where I wanted to go with it right now. In Exodus chapter 1, the people that were enslaved to Egypt were getting great in number. So the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom was Shiphrah and the other one was Puah. And he said, when you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women and set them on the birth stools, if it is a son, then you shall kill him, but if it is a daughter, then she shall live. Verse 17 says, but the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing and saved the male children alive? And the midwife said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are lively and give birth before the midwives come to them. In other words, they told Pharaoh a lie. They were saving the man children alive, but they told him that the children were already being born before they get there. Now, what they were doing was they were protecting the children. And at the same time, they were protecting their own lives because they knew that without the midwives, there would be a lot of times that birth would be a troublesome experience for the women. In verse 20, it says, "Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multitude and grew mightily." So if Pharaoh told them to do something and they didn't do it, but yet they turned around and told Pharaoh that we didn't do it because they were already born, when in reality they were doing it, they were lying to Pharaoh. But yet we see God was dealing well with the midwives. So the question now comes is it right to tell a lie to save someone's life? Take these school shootings. If you were a teacher and someone came to the door and said, "Where's your children in this classroom?" and you got them hid out in the closet in the back of the room, and you tell them they're down the road, down the hall in another room, and the guy says, "Okay," and then pulls the gun on you and kills you, will God condemn you for saving the lives of these children when he turns around and goes the other way? Sometimes we have to look at the situation that we're in and take advantage of what tools of defense we may have in certain situations. Now, I think what Revelation chapter 21 is referring to is those people that live by and love to make lies, and in all situations, that is their life. And this is not the situation that we see here. So hopefully that kind of gives you something to think about. Now, there may be some in the audience that may disagree with me, but we don't want to open up the floor to that. But something to think about in your time, and we can probably discuss it later if you have some objections. Now, when they searched and could not find them, they returned, and they came, and after they departed, the men came out of the well and went to David and told him, "Don't tarry this evening. Get your people across the Jordan and get the river between you and Absalom, because he is on his way after you." And so they did just that. They got up, they crossed the Jordan, and by the morning light, there was none of them left on that side. And now when Ahithophel saw that his advice was not followed, he saddled a donkey, went to his house, set things in order, and hung himself. Now, why? Why would he do that? That was another kind of a crazy situation that kind of went through my mind. If your advice isn't followed, is that enough to commit suicide? What would drive Ahithophel to do that? And even though it says he saw that his advice was not followed, I think there was a lot of other things going on in his mind that we could probably speculate that was kind of driving his actions towards what he was doing. Realizing now that his advice was not followed, he kind of felt like he was second place in Absalom's line of counselors. So he kind of fell in position there. But I think he also knew what kind of warrior David was, and that the advice that Hushai gave Absalom was not good advice, because he knew that once David had enough time to assemble his armies, to get organized and get his defenses together, the time that was now given to David was going to be detrimental to Absalom. So he was probably thinking, Absalom is going to be overthrown. There's a good possibility that's going to happen. Even if it doesn't happen, I don't think David's going to die, and I think now I'm going to be in David's sights. He's done a lot, I think, to harm David. He was counselor when all of this uprising was beginning with Absalom, and David didn't know anything about it. I kind of think that Ahithophel kept it from him. When spies were being sent out into the land, word that was coming back to Jerusalem did not reach David's ears. Ahithophel kept that from him. And then again, the situation with Bathsheba being his granddaughter, it's, Ahithophel was looking at this situation, it's not going to go well for Absalom, it's not going to go well for me, and now that I've lost position, there's a good chance that David is going to seek his vengeance upon my head. So it would be better for me to take my own life and die in the
the sight of the people, a noble man, than to be executed by David as a traitor to the nation. So some of the things that kind of came to my mind, and it kind of drove him to do what he had done. Now, one thing I think David Pratt pointed out in his book is that whenever you look at the history of people that commit suicide in the Bible, all of them were sinful men to begin with. They were very, proud of themselves. They were very anxious for the things that they wanted in life, and when they didn't obtain it, it was just, they were miserable people to begin with. So, if you haven't read that part in the book, go ahead and take a look at it. Now, when he had committed suicide, they said he buried him in his father's tomb. Then in verse 24, we see David continuing his journey until he winds up in Mahanaim. And at this particular time, Absalom crossed the river Jordan, so he was now getting close to where David was at. And now, Joab makes a decision about his army. Absalom makes a decision about the army. Joab was in charge of it up to this point, and now Absalom is probably beginning to think, Joab has been David's captain now for many, many years. What would keep him from turning this army against me? So he removes him as being captain, and he sets his nephew, or David's nephew, Amasa, up as the captain of the army. And with that, I think Joab leaves, travels on into the city, and regroups with David. I think the whole point of what Joab was trying to do was trying to keep the army settled in David's favor during this whole time. It would be to David's advantage to have the army to rely on to help him get back into power. But that didn't happen, and now Joab was going to have to fall back and regroup with David to put this other situation under hand. Now, I'm not sure what kind of captain Amasa was. He probably wasn't as good as Joab, but the point being is that we have to understand Joab did not defect to Absalom during any of this. 2 Kings chapter 2, I think, says that during the life of David, he did not defect to Absalom. So he was still working in David's favor, trying to keep the nation together under David as best he could. Now, when David finally came to Mahanaim, we see the three individuals we mentioned earlier that brought provisions to him. We have Shobi, the son of Nahash from Rabbah, of the people of Ammon; Maker, the son of Amiel from Lo-debar. This was the man who took care of Mephibosheth; and Barzillai, the Gideite from Regilium. And they brought beds, basins, earthen vessels, wheat, barley, just all kinds of food, and for David and for the people who were with them to eat, and the people were hungry from their travels in the wilderness. So we do see these people showing kindness to David, and I think even though he was going through all the troubles that he was going through, he was now, he had friends that cared for him, and he had a considerable amount of people that was willing to fight for him. And these were indeed valiant people, as we'll see through this next chapter, how he sets up his army to go after Joab. So, what can we learn from all of this? I kind of went through it kind of quick, but some of the things that kind of came to my mind was that when you're seeking advice, don't rely on just one person's advice. Seek as much as you can before you make your final decision, and make that decision with as much wisdom as you can. In other words, use wisdom when you obtain advice, and don't let vanity drive your decision. I think it was vanity that drove Absalom to make the decision that he made. He could see the glory of being the one killing David. He saw the glory of the one leading a great army. And he saw the glory of returning back to Jerusalem as the sole king of the whole nation. And we see that throughout his life. We saw many places so far where we see the vanity of Absalom. But use wisdom when you obtain advice, and don't let vanity drive your decision in what you choose to do.
Always be truthful and use discretion in desperate situations. You know, even though we go back to Exodus to see where God approved of these women lying, don't think that that's the exception to every case that you see. It's not. I think that sometimes we have to do what we have to do at the spur of the moment to keep other people safe from harm. And even then, it's not a desirable thing for us to do. You know, it's kind of like Timothy, when Paul told Timothy, take a little wine for your stomach's sake. You know, why did Paul tell Timothy that? Is because Timothy had a stomach problem, and he had stopped drinking wine to take care of it. And Paul was telling him, he said, you need to take it for your stomach. But Timothy was thinking, this is taking one step closer to being a drunkard, and a drunkard will not go into heaven. So it's the same thing here. You know, we have to kind of, you know, decide what we're going to do and take the best course of action that we can take. Be always ready to provide for those in need, and live in such a way that will be willing to help you, that those that are willing to help you when it is needed. So we can see some valuable lessons here, and like I said, there are some things that will, you know, I think I brought up that may generate discussion down the road. But does anybody have any comments or questions? Lots of questions.
Just so much.
Well, it's, you know, it's kind of a, you know, not really an involved chapter, but a lot of events are happening. And so the gist of the whole thing is that God has defeated Absalom's advice, the good advice, and replaced it with advice that would be helpful for David. God was taking care of David to the extent that he was going to maintain his throne and his lineage. And God's plans were not going to be thwarted by any man such as Absalom that came upon the scene to decide to do otherwise. And we see the events beginning to unfold. We see David leaving Jerusalem in such a hurry, he didn't know what was going on. It was just, you know, it just stunned him. And now he's fleeing for his life with those that would follow him. They cross over with Absalom chasing him with a huge army. And then we see in chapter 18, when David has got enough time together to get his wits about him, to understand the military situation, to put things in place to provide his men with the best opportunities to overtake Absalom in this war. And even though he does handicap his troops to some extent.
I just don't know why. They know that God is on David's side, you know, and
Well,
so why would they even, they just wanted to take over the reign, I guess.
Well, we do know that the nation knew that David was the anointed king. So if the king was anointed by God, then he was the one that has the rightful throne. And even though David had his share of problems, he did bring the nation up to its greatest heights. And so there were people that understood the significance of having David on the throne was for their own benefit and for their own good. From the spiritual standpoint, I think the nation knew of David's sins, and they knew the punishment that God has placed upon him. But they also knew that God had promised David that his house would be there forever. And it never did die until the nation of Judah was taken into captivity. But the kingdom the kingdom physically ended there, but his lineage brought forth Jesus Christ, which is now the king sitting upon the throne of David in heaven. Well,
David, what was Solomon doing all this time? Just a young kid or younger?
he was probably a young kid. We don't have any record of Solomon's activities until he becomes king. And I think he becomes king when he's probably in his early to mid 20s. So this would probably put him around 15 years old. Because these events in David's life was happening in the latter part of his reign. And we
time scale, a few lessons back. And so this was probably happening around the time David was around 60, 65 years of age. And we know he died at 70, so this is happening towards the end of his reign. We know he's an old man because as we go a little bit further, as he's battling some people, he gets wore out and has to sit down. And at that point, the generals tell him to go back to the city, let us take care of the heavy lifting. And so they were trying to take care of him there. So I think, again, we see Joab trying to do damage control for David and keeping the armies in his favor until Amasa takes over. And then again, we'll see him doing more damage control in chapter 18. So whatever you want to say about Joab, he was trying to do what was best for the nation. And sometimes that, as we'll see in the next chapter, involves disobeying direct orders. Anyway, any more questions, comments?
I just thought of another example of God approving of someone who basically lied with Rahab and the spies.
Yeah.
She protected and hid them, and God approved of what she did.
You know, it kind of seems to me that if you're in a situation where the only weapon you've got is your mouth, sometimes you have to do what you have to do to save another person's life. Now, like I said earlier, it's not something that you can use to take advantage of someone else to gain property or gain their, some ill-gotten gain. But I think when you're in a situation that you could be responsible for another person's life, you'll probably do what you have to do to protect their life, even if that lie that you tell is found out may cost your own. I think in God's sight, he understands the justification of it. And it is enough love for another person to save their life at the risk of losing your own. Now, Ananias and Sapphira, they lied about the land. And, they didn't have to, but they did. And they did it to gain, what's what I'm looking for? I guess it was the pride of saying, we gave so much to the Lord, and even though they pocketed so much, they weren't going to say anything about it. So that deception was a deception of pride and vanity, I guess, and was disapproved of by God. So.
You look at Esau and Jacob. God let that happen too,
Esau and Jacob.
where he tricked his dad over the birthright.
Yeah, on the birthright.
And God allowed that to transpire.
Yeah. So anyway, some things to think about, and I do appreciate y'all's attention. Chapter 18, we'll look at the ensuing battle and how things transpired there.